Thanks for coming. My name is Jeff LeGros. I'm a professor here in politics at the University of Virginia and a faculty associate in the Gage program here at the Mellor Center. We're delighted to see you today, kicking off our second day on our conference When Walls Came Down, Berlin, 9/11, and U.S. Strategy in Uncertain Times. And just to remind you or introduce to some of you who might not have been here yesterday, what we're trying to look at is to look back at the aftermath of these cataclysmic events, the fall of the wall 20 years ago in Berlin, and the 9/11 attacks more recently in 2001, to try and examine how the United States plans for strategy in the wake of dramatic events and in situations where it's facing a complex and uncertain world. We're trying to learn from these periods how we might better, as a country, deal with the complex and dynamic world that we face today. Delighted this morning to have an esteemed policymaker, Paul Wolfowitz, on our panel. Mr. Wolfowitz has served in many prominent positions in the U.S. government. We don't have enough time this morning to go through all of them. So what I'm going to focus on is just where he was after 1989 and 1991. Related to the fall of the Berlin Wall from 1989 to 1993, he served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the administration of George H.W. Bush, Bush 41 as we know him. Related to post 9/11, he was U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense from 2001 to 2005 in the George W. Bush administration, Bush 43. In between that time, he even had a more exalted post as a professor and dean at the SAIS school at Johns Hopkins. So he also has academic chops as well. And today he's currently a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. We're going to kick off our session. He'll make a couple introductory remarks, and then Mel Leffler will start it off by interviewing him with a few questions, and then we'll turn the discussion open for Q&A. Mel Leffler, as you know, is a faculty associate here at the Miller Center's Governing America and Global Era program, and he's the Edward Stettinius Professor in the Department of History at the University of Virginia. As you all know, or most of you know, he's a superb scholar, and for those who do know him, he's even a better person. And I just want to say that Mel had the idea for this event, and he's been the main force behind it. And as always, it's been a pleasure and privilege to work with him. So, Paul, please.
Well, you didn't mention the job that was the most fun and that I would, in some ways, still wish I had, which was being U.S. Ambassador to Indonesia, 1986 to 89. And I guess I have to get that out. But also, George Shultz under Reagan instituted a 3-year rule for ambassadors. I'm not sure this has ever been revealed before, but the real reason was to have a way to get rid of politically appointed ambassadors, to put a limit on the term. Wasn't totally successful. But at any rate, I thought I was reaching the end of my 3 years when first President Bush was elected, and I thought, well, this is the first time in my life I've actually personally known a president-elect, because I had worked with Bush pretty closely on U.S.-Japan relations when he was vice president and I was assistant secretary, and I thought maybe I can use this access to get extension of the 3-year rule and stay in Indonesia a little bit longer. And then John Tower, who some of you may recall was the unfortunately later unsuccessful nominee for Secretary of Defense, called and asked me to come and be his Undersecretary for Policy, and I realized I couldn't exactly go to the White House and say, you know, I have something much more important to do over here in Jakarta, would you please let me stay? So anyway, that's how I ended up in the Pentagon, more or less. You know, when you get to be my age, there are 3 things that start to go. One is your eyesight, it's true. Another is your hearing. Can't remember what the third one is. Which goes along with another saying, which is also as you get to be my age, your memory becomes more and more precise about things that never happened. So with those cautions, I really actually appreciate the opportunity that this conference has given me to try to dredge through my memory about things that I think happened, that may or may not have happened. And like Bob Zellick, I genuinely appreciate the opportunity to continue this exchange with scholars, scholars who are more familiar with the overall record, with the documentary record, hopefully some who are familiar with the Soviet side of it, which I think is too often left out, which was in some ways the most critical piece of it. At any rate, I also have to add another caution. When we first talked about this, and pretty much until I came here, in my head at least, it's to talk about when the Berlin Wall came down. And while I know a lot about the 2001 period, my memory, frankly, needs more refreshing on that, so I'm not sure I would have too much to add, although I'm sure people are going to want to ask me things. I'll see what I can do about those questions. Speaking of memory, I can no longer remember when it was that I last read War and Peace, and I can't even remember whether I read it once or twice. It tells you how long ago it was. But I do remember there's a long discussion in Tolstoy about the great man view of history, and my recollection more or less is that he says that actually history moves through these powerful forces that even men as powerful as Napoleon are powerless to actually shape. Actually, I think it's a section of War and Peace that really is worth rereading for the philosophy of history or the understanding of history. At any rate, it stands in fairly stark contrast to the title of one of the books about the end of the Cold War period by Strobe Talbott and Michael Beschloss, which is called At the Highest Levels. And it is entirely the view of those events from the highest levels. And I think, I guess I should also add a caveat about that book. I was not one of the anonymous sources for the Talbott-Beschloss book. It's not their fault. They actually came to me when the project was starting. I think it was Strobe who did, and said, here's what we want to do. And this is a confession I've never made before in public, but I guess you might as well know it. I went to Cheney and I said, I think this is a very bad idea. Not because I'm against history, and not because of reservations about these first drafts of history, although I'll say a word about that, but frankly because I was concerned, I've seen it before, that it becomes a kind of poisonous influence within the government. Because even though they say, and they keep their word, that nothing will be published until after the events, they will nevertheless go to the people in, for my case, Defense Department, and say, do you know what those guys at State are saying about the idiots in DOD? And they're protecting their sources. They don't tell you who said it. But it goes back and forth, and I think actually an illustration of that to some extent was the famous book, The Commanders, by Bob Woodward, done at the same time, which really did cause some serious problems, more after it was published. But so I had a reservation about it. I had assumed, but I have never had a chance to ask him, that Cheney may have raised this concern with Scowcroft, and that was the last I heard of the subject. So my guess, I can't confirm this either, is they decided, okay, DOD doesn't want to participate. And I suppose it's our fault. That's why we're not really represented in the book. It's not their fault. I think there is a problem well identified by historians about these first drafts, that you don't know the sources. I think what is sometimes not sufficiently observed in that is not only do you not know the sources, you don't even know the motives of the sources. And that isn't really necessary. I mean, you could protect your sources and still say, well, we think this source was motivated in their view of the subject by such and such. But then they wouldn't want to talk to you the next time. People don't talk to Bob Woodward in order to get an accurate historical version of things. They talk to Bob Woodward to promote themselves. And there's a little bit of a deal that has to go on in order to make that happen. But finally, I'll just say one more thing. I think anonymity conveys an authority that is spurious, actually. And it's not only journalists who do this. I would say it happens in intelligence reports. I saw this particularly at the time we're talking about here, when suddenly the Soviet Union opened up, and you could read reports from diplomats saying, in my conversation yesterday with the deputy foreign minister, he said X, Y, and Z, and it would be very revealing, or even more significantly with somebody who's not in government saying critical things about the government. You could read almost exactly the same thing in a CIA report, but it would be anonymous. It would say, a a generally reliable source who has no reporting relationship with us or something like that, indicating we're not paying him for this information, but boy, is it inside dope. And it's the same information. You realize they're talking to the same political party leader or the same foreign ministry official, but in the case of the State Department reporting, you can figure out what this guy's motives are. In the case of this anonymous thing, you're given the impression that you're let in on something deeply secret, when in fact you're actually, there's a curtain over it. And I think I just say, I'm not against these first drafts, but I just think they should be read with enormous caution. One of the problems, to be fair, is the implication the second draft's going to be more accurate because it'll refer to documents. That's a problem too. Remember what Henry Kissinger once said, nobody comes off second best in their own memorandums of conversation. So the documentary record isn't perfect either. I think the answer is just look at all of this stuff skeptically, check it all against something else, and that includes the remarks I'm about to make. To go back to Tolstoy versus the highest levels, I think it's probably fair to say that what was taking place underneath in mass publics, if you want to use phrases like that, was perhaps much more important than what was taking place at the highest levels, and much of what was happening was perhaps beyond the control of leaders, at least by 1989. So with that opening, let me just make a few, tell a few anecdotes, each of them hopefully to make a point. First one is a story, true story, that when I was working for Cheney, sometime, I think probably early 1991 or late 1990, he received a visit from a young Russian, remarkable young man, whose name I'd like to recover, but at any rate, he had organized the first ever organization in support of disabled people in the former and then the Soviet Union. And he was so impressive that the famous astronaut Yuri Gagarin decided not to run against him in the elections for some Moscow municipality election. And he came to see Cheney. We had an interesting conversation about what was going on in then still the Soviet Union. And as he left, he said that he was going to California to visit the father of perestroika. And after we got past the accent and understood he meant that he was going to see Reagan as the father of perestroika, we decided to ask him, well, why do you say that Reagan was the father of perestroika? We thought it's Mikhail Gorbachev. He said, no, it's because of stealth. And we still had to figure out, you know, stealth, the B-2, the bomber. So because of stealth in the SDI, he said, and I'm simply quoting him or paraphrasing him very closely, he said, Reagan showed the Soviet military that they couldn't compete the way they were going and that something had to change. And small changes led to bigger changes, and before they knew it, the changes were out of control. I'm not saying it's accurate just because this impressive young man said it. I think we'll have a debate probably till the end of time as to what led to perestroika, how much of it was Gorbachev personally, and certainly he played a huge role in history, but some would say he too was surfing a wave rather than really steering a boat. Well, the second anecdote concerns the more generally acknowledged father of perestroika, Mikhail Gorbachev. I had the opportunity to see him again. I don't want to suggest that I see him frequently, but I saw him not for the first time in Berlin earlier this month, on German Unification Day, when he was there to receive this very distinguished prize, the Quadriga Prize, which, by the way, was also awarded to Václav Havel and to a gentleman named de Maizière, who, in spite of his French name, was the last East German prime minister. And I was commenting to one of his longtime associates who was there with him that he is really viewed here as a hero. We were out in front of the Reichs, is it still called the Reichstag? Anyway, the German parliament, planting a tree, and people love him, understandably enough. And this old-time associate of his said, well, you know, he doesn't consider himself the hero. He says there are two heroes. And I thought, oh, well, does he mean Reagan? No, the two heroes are the German people and the Russian people. And I think first of all, I think it's an interesting comment about Gorbachev. Reagan had a sign on his desk that said there's no limit to what you can accomplish as long as you're willing to let other people get the credit. And even if it's a little bit of false modesty, I'm sure Gorbachev does realize he was a rather important figure in history. I think there's something fundamental there, and what this associate of his said in fact, it really was a popular movement. And he said, we took a whole bunch of polls at the beginning of Gorbachev's rule, including even among Soviet communist elites in the Soviet military, that said the Soviet people wanted, this is a rather important difference, and I don't remember whether he said wanted peace with the Germans or actually wanted German unification. And I was startled. I said, well, why was that? And he said, well, the war was a long time ago. People thought it was time to forget it and get over it. And I said, well, no, it wasn't that long ago. It was 40 years. A lot of the people were still alive who had suffered. Akrameyev, for example, who was the Soviet defense minister, had suffered through 3 years or whatever it was of the siege of Leningrad. I said, maybe they wanted change in the Soviet Union. And he said, yes, that also. I think there must have been a pretty deep recognition that not only Afghanistan, but a whole lot of other things had gone very badly, most of all, perhaps the economy. The change was needed. And I suppose, in some sense, the sense that this empire they were hanging on to in Eastern Europe was a burden and an obstacle to change. This is something that takes more than just historians. I think it probably takes sociologists to figure it all out, and even then we'll be debating this till the end of time. But I'd put that question on the table and say that perhaps the real strategic decisions were in fact the ones made in the 1980s, the decisions, for example, to support Lech Walesa in Poland in coordination with the Vatican, that those were times when the future wasn't inevitable, but that by 1989, I think some of what we're talking about was going to happen no matter what took place at the highest levels. I don't mean to depreciate that view of things, I just want to put it as a caution. And to further illustrate that sentiment, I have never forgotten, or maybe I now suddenly remember, but I remember rather vividly when Yeltsin visited the Pentagon in June of 1990. And do I have the year right? Was it 90 or 91? 91. See? Okay, but I do remember the event. I remember that the two things that impressed him the most were the large shopping mall that was inside the building and the long corridor that was inhabited by members of the free press. The press, I suppose he knew it was free. But the most amazing thing for me was when we sat down and met with Cheney, and Cheney commented on the fact that we were reading reports about plans to increase the Soviet defense budget. And this man, who had been the former party boss of Sverdlovsk, I believe, said, and this is a quote, best of my memory, increasing the Soviet defense budget would be a crime against the Russian people who have already suffered enough under 70 years of communism. Now, you can't make that stuff up just to ingratiate yourself with the Secretary of Defense. I mean, you could have said any number of things to say, I don't agree with that. That had to come from the gut. And when somebody who is that much part of the system as to be the party boss of Sverdlovsk and now the elected president of the Russian Federation says that, you know there's something, I think, very, very deep in that system. Third anecdote, and this is, to be honest, partly to set the record straight, because I think the story of Bush's CFE proposal in May of 1989 at the NATO summit is, in a number of places, incomplete or inaccurate. By the way, I'll try not to use Pentagon acronyms, but CFE was not a Pentagon acronym. It's it's an arms control acronym. It stands for Conventional Forces in Europe negotiation, which was initiated in 1988. And in fact, I know that when Cheney became secretary, he was very much focused on the importance of reducing Soviet conventional forces in Europe, that really was the major problem. We were saddled with something else which had more political profile at the time. That was a proposal inherited called Follow-on to Lance, which was to modernize one of the short-range nuclear missiles in Europe, which really, I mean, that was one of these ideas that may have seemed necessary back in the bad old days of 1985, but you know how long it takes Pentagon programs to evolve and then finally to be obsolete and then finally to be recognized as obsolete. At any rate, here this thing was floating out in the middle of all this hopeful situation in Germany, and Germans were saying, what on earth are the Americans, I wouldn't say all Germans, but most of them were pretty upset about the idea of new nuclear weapons in Europe. and we didn't need them. But what we really did need was a reduction in Soviet conventional threat. And there was a view within the new administration that the CFE proposal that had been put on the table in late 1988 by the Reagan administration was stale and dull. Okay, there's a good word. And we really needed something new and imaginative. They generated some big bureaucratic exercises. I had the misfortune to chair one of them called NSR 12. Big bureaucratic exercises are not a way to generate new ideas. It's a good way to kill them because everyone with a vested interest sees a new idea and they say, wait, that's a bad idea, and before you can even develop the arguments for it, it's gone. They're not a bad way to test new ideas if someone like the President of the United States or the Secretary of Defense says, this is what I want to do. You may want to go through, there's a lot to be said for a thorough scrubbing, as we might call it, and hear what the arguments are against it, but you've got to have some push to get new ideas through. In the search for new ideas, we actually had, I thought, the surprising notion that came, I believe, from Brent Scowcroft, that maybe in order to compete with all of Gorbachev's exciting initiatives that were capturing public attention in the spring of 1989, we should consider proposing to withdraw U.S. and Soviet troops from Europe. The Soviets backed east within their borders and the U.S. across the Atlantic. In hindsight, I don't understand, well, I didn't understand at the time, Cheney didn't understand at the time. That was one of those new ideas that I think, in my view, fortunately, did get smothered in the cradle. Maybe Scowcroft was just putting it out to be provocative. That's entirely possible. But at any rate, we were scraping for new ideas. And the way I remember this meeting, we had a meeting in the White House. Baker had just come back from Moscow and was reporting on his discussions with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze about arms control proposals. I'm sorry, this is going to get a little wonkish, but the U.S. proposal at the time was basically to say we should reduce to equal and lower levels, and the level should be 10% below NATO levels, I think 10%, in tanks, artillery, and armored personnel carriers, on the grounds that these three pieces of equipment, number one, were the keys to offensive capability, and number two, you could verify them by satellite, so-called national technical means. Personnel, you can't really count by photograph. So we didn't want to get into a personnel issue. We, that is the U.S. position at that point. And when Baker went to Moscow, Gorbachev talked about 25% reductions. And Baker came back kind of annoyed. You know, once again, the U.S. is behind Gorbachev. He's talking 25%, we're talking 10%. And in this meeting in the White House, I went along with Cheney, and Cheney said, well, if you look at the actual numbers instead of the percentages, you'll see that Gorbachev is assuming a much higher number for the U.S. than we are. So his 25% comes out to the same number of tanks as our 10% does. In effect, the Soviets had accepted the U.S. Reagan administration proposal in terms of numerically, same ceiling on tanks, same ceiling on artillery, and same ceiling on APCs. Well, Baker thought about that, and then he kind of came back in rebuttal, and he said, yes, but they want to limit aircraft and helicopters and manpower as well. And I think he was probably surprised, and I haven't seen this in the record, but I was there, and I'm about as sure as one can be about one's memory. Cheney said, well, we don't mind including aircraft and helicopters. It would be fine with us to see a reduction in those as well. And I think this sort of hit like a bit of a bombshell, because it had been thought that aircraft, number one, was the sort of key equalizer, that we were so superior in the air that that was something we didn't want to negotiate on. And secondly, it was known that, particularly for Mrs. Thatcher, but also for the French, aircraft, quote, dual-capable aircraft, which meant they could deliver nuclear weapons as well, were going down a road they didn't want to go down. Well, this became quite interesting. We had a meeting up in Kennebunkport where I accompanied Cheney and Admiral Crowe to present DOD's version of how to implement this, and we went over the aircraft and helicopter piece of it. That was pretty easy. Then we got to how do we respond to the sixth element, which is the Soviets wanted to limit manpower. I don't know the reason, but I suspect when you get into limiting manpower, you're talking about cutting the size of the U.S. Army, ultimately. That's what's going on. And Crow, being a sort of compromiser, didn't want to take on one of his biggest service chiefs on limiting the size of the Army. So he was, I think, saying only 10%. And we got into this fairly significant, or contentious is a better word, battle. Would it be 10% or 25%? And I think the president finally said it's going to be 25%. And Cheney said to Crow, the president is the commander-in-chief, we do what he says. But the thing that really was the breakthrough here was the aircraft and helicopters. And so much so that when Bush correctly decided to give our allies at least a heads up, you know, it's interesting. If you tell somebody you're about to do something 24 hours before you do it, it's consultation. If you tell them 24 hours after you've done it, and which is 36 hours after they've read it in the press, it's as the Japanese would call it, a shaku. And Bush was aware that whether Thatcher and Mitterrand liked this idea or not, at least it would make a huge difference if they weren't surprised by it. And Mrs. Thatcher was, to put it mildly, unhappy. In fact, I think later Gates and Eagleburger were sent on some other mission to London, and she said something to the effect of, I remember the last time you two gentlemen sat in these chairs, what is bad news do you have for me now? But in fact, this was a breakthrough, and I think Cheney understood maybe better than some what a breakthrough it was. I was sent to the summit to represent him. I was on the backup plane, I think for bureaucratic reasons rather than space reasons, but I don't know. At any rate, about an hour before we're due to land, I got a call from Brent Scowcroft saying the president wanted to insert some language in the communique that would commit us to a negotiation on short-range nuclear forces with the Soviets. And all I remember is that Cheney was firmly against starting another nuclear negotiation. I don't remember his reasons, but his view was quite clear. So I said to Brent, well, all I can say is my boss is opposed to that. So he said, not too pleased, well, would you like to tell that to the President of the United States? Well, the strict answer was I had no desire whatsoever to tell it to the President of the United States. But I said, I think I would not be doing a service to him or to the Secretary if I didn't at least have him understand Secretary of Defense's view on this. So I was told, okay, we'll set up a call. So I waited by the phone, not exactly in eager anticipation of getting this phone call from the Commander-in-Chief, and waited and waited and waited, and we landed. And call hadn't come, and by the time we landed, it was clear that Cheney was right, that in fact the enthusiasm for this new conventional initiative had pretty much blown away the whole anxiety about follow-on to Lance and about short-range nuclear weapons, and the focus became on conventional force reductions. And I guess I tell that story partly to tell a story and correct the record, but also because I think Cheney had a good sense at that point of what was going on outside the meeting room in a sense and what would go on. Okay, I'm going to run a little bit over, but I'll try to keep it short. A fourth anecdote. When I was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs, back before I went to Indonesia, I was the very grateful inheritor of an institution started by someone who's become quite well known now. That's Richard Holbrooke, called the East Asia Informal. Once a week, the sort of key people who worked on East Asian affairs would meet in the Assistant Secretary's office, actually. We were the leaders of it, just to sort of go around the room and say what's going on, what do we think of it. It was not a decision meeting. There was no staffing for it, no bureaucracy behind it, and relatively little reporting out of it. But it enabled us to know ahead of time where there might be a collision coming between the State Department and the Defense Department, or between both of us and the White House. And in fact, I remember at one point Shultz had commented that he was struck at how much more interagency cooperation there was in East Asia than in any of the other regions of the world. There are other reasons for that. I'm not attributing it all to the informal, but the informal was a good thing. So when I don't remember whether it was before the wall came down, shortly before, shortly afterwards, but I talked to Reg Bartholomew, who was the Undersecretary of State for Security Affairs, and said, why don't we set up Europe Informal? Just bring in, without regard to position, senior people in state DOD and the White House. And we did that, and we started discussing what's going on. And the one thing I remember very clearly from this is in the course of 2 or 3 discussions, the thinking went from saying, well, maybe we have to accept some form of neutrality for Germany in order to get unification. That was, to some extent, the mindset. To realizing, wait a minute, this isn't even good for the Soviets. It's not good for anybody. I remember a quotation, I don't know if it came up at that meeting, from a senior German general saying, a neutral Germany would be like a loose cannon rolling around on the deck of Europe. This was a German. So we became firmly convinced that even though the threat was gone away, the alliance was very important. It was very important as a way of allowing everybody to get security at lower levels, which is not only cheaper, but it's also less threatening to neighbors. So much so that when we got to the NATO summit after Malta in May of 1989, we were on the floor of the meeting, and we saw the remarks that were being prepared for Bush to deliver, and with respect to German unification, one of the things he was going to say, and here my memory is more precise than Bartholomew's, doesn't mean it's more accurate, remember, more precise. I believe it said a unified Germany has to be associated with NATO. What Bartholomew remembers is that when I showed it to him, we agreed there was something there that was potentially harmful for the alliance. And we went immediately to Baker and said, this is not a good thing. We need German membership in NATO, not German association with NATO. And I think his initial reaction was, well, the Soviets will never accept that. And I think we said something like, you won't know unless you try. And Baker's a great negotiator. He said, yes, that should be our opening position. And to his great credit, by the way, and Bob Zellick and a lot of other people, what looked like something the Soviets would never accept eventually became something they embraced. That was the 2+4 process. But I would like to think that it was important there at the beginning that we had achieved this agreement between principals, that is, not principals, whatever you call Bartholomew and me at that level, that this was something important, and we didn't have to have a 3-hour discussion about whether this language was harmful or not. We agreed with it right away, and were able to change it at the last minute. I'll say something else, and if you give me an opportunity in questions to talk about informal processes, but let me, 2 more things. This notion of the importance of preserving alliances became a very significant part of the process that then got started shortly after the wall came down. Cheney summoned Powell and me to his office. The only other person there, I believe, was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Mr. Atwood. And he said, more or less, this isn't quite a direct quote, but it's a close paraphrase. He said, I'm going to have to go up to the Hill and defend one more Cold War budget. And they're going to take a piece of hide out of my back, but that's okay, that's my job. Meantime, I want you guys to start developing a post-Cold War budget. We can't do this another time. And I want you to keep it no leaks, and I want you to do it independently. And this set in train a 6-month process, roughly, that culminated in briefings that we gave to the Defense Policy and Resources Board in May of 1990, in which a couple of years later became the Regional Defense Strategy, or in a leaked form and somewhat inaccurate form, the infamous Defense Planning Guidance. And I think it was successful in no small measure because it was done privately, secretly, I guess you have to say that. And this is a difficult issue. I mean, what's the balance between getting good deliberation and getting transparency about what you're deliberating about? And I think you need transparency, but I think it has to come perhaps at different stages. At any rate, one of the main conclusions of this that we pushed through was this idea that preserving our alliances was essential, even though there was no threat. I recall when President Bush was asked something about what's the threat now that the Soviet Union's gone away, and he said something like the threat is uncertainty, or I think in a different setting he said the threat is instability and unpredictability. And some wiseacres said, paraphrasing Stalin's comment about how many divisions does the Pope have, somebody said, well, how many divisions does uncertainty have? But there was a lot of wisdom in that, actually, I think fundamental wisdom. And it was a key part of what we put into this briefing that we gave to Cheney and Atwood in May of '89. It became a key part of the later defense planning guidance and the regional defense strategy. It turned into what we called shaping the strategic environment, which basically means that the U.S. military posture exerts a huge influence even without being used. In this case, the reassurance given to Japan and Germany that they don't have to embark on their own military buildups is not a combat use of American military power, but it's at least as important as anything else. And by the time we unveiled the full regional defense strategy in 1992, or actually was finally signed out as Cheney went out the door in January because we couldn't get clearance on it. And I think finally in January he said, I don't care whether it's cleared or not, I'm signing this. One of the key elements in it was shaping the strategic environment. And we couldn't say that we were favoring NATO enlargement because that was not Bush administration policy. But that's basically one of the things we were pointing to, is that what's good for Germany is good for Poland, that a neutral Poland stuck between a hostile Soviet Union and a Germany where some Polish citizens greeted Helmut Kohl with signs, Helmut unser Kanzler, in that period. That is to say, we want the reunification of entire Germany back to the 1937 borders. It didn't seem like a good idea to have a neutral Poland. And I have to give a lot of credit to the Clinton administration, not just because Walt Slocum is here, but he can at least note they got the enlargement done, and I think it was hugely successful. Instead of becoming, as some people feared, a wall down the center of Europe, I think it became a bridge across Europe. One can argue whether we should have opened the door more widely to Russia or not. We can discuss that. But I do think what that story also illustrates is something important about Cheney, and it's no secret that I'm a big admirer, so you can discount me. But I think when you come to these historic things where huge change is taking place, you may, in Yogi Berra's famous words, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. You may be coming to a fork in the road. One reaction is, uh-oh, there's trouble down this way. I'm going to stand in front of history and yell, stop. And another one is to say, oh, everything has changed. The Cold War is over. We don't need military forces anymore. We can withdraw, excuse me, and go too far in the other direction. And I think what you really need to have is an ability to say, this could go good, it could go badly. We need to be prepared for either. And I think to a considerable extent, and I could argue in much more detail, I think we did that. I'll save this for questions, but I'll just make an assertion, which is inviting a question. I mean, I think one thing that we as an administration got seriously wrong was the balance between stability and change. And stability is certainly a laudable thing when it means peace and saving lives. So I'm not saying that it's this stodgy. And people were concerned about the possibility of conflict in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union. But I actually think that if you look at Yugoslavia, where we leaned on the side of stability, you can see that in that case, change was the only thing that could have, I think, preserved the peace. And in the case of the former Soviet Union, change is what preserved the peace. And the notion that by which I think we came dangerously close to, of leaning against Ukrainian independence, might have encouraged a much less peaceful outcome. I'm going to end with two quotes. One, Margaret Thatcher, at the, I guess it was, well, at the NATO summit in July of 1990, I think it was sort of really the one that declared the end of the Cold War. And I think her opening words were, Europe stands today at the dawn of a new era, as promising in its own way as 1919 and 1945. And I think some people in the audience missed the irony in her voice. But clearly she meant to say, look, we didn't get it right in 1919, we didn't get it right in 1945, let's not be so sure we've got it right now. And I think it was less than 2 weeks later that Saddam Hussein moved his forces to the Kuwaiti border. And before you knew it, we were into an entirely brand new crisis and a new problem, which I will say was anticipated in the briefing we gave Cheney in the previous May, but that's not my point of the quote. Real point is uncertainty is fundamental to everything here. The other quote is from Gorbachev at Malta. I was in some of the meetings there, and I remember at one point he said to President Bush, please don't talk about Western values. They're ours too. He should have added parenthetically, or at least we'd like them to be. I don't think he made that addition. They're ours too, so please talk about democratic values. And I make that quote for two reasons. First of all, I think it is a fundamental factor in shaping the world. I'm accused sometimes of being messianic on this point. I'm not messianic, I'm realistic. I think if you're realistic about things, you realize that one of the most powerful forces at work in the world today is that these democratic values are not purely Western, and they're not just limited to Japanese in Asia, and they're not just limited to Indonesians in Asia. And if you have any doubt about this, go read Prisoner of the State by a former Communist Party boss in China who talks about the need for separation of powers, not just democracy, but Westminster democracy. Doesn't mean it works all the time. It doesn't mean that we can make it happen all the time. And by the way, it certainly doesn't mean we should be imposing it by force. I don't believe that at all. But it certainly means that it's very unrealistic not to recognize that this is a powerful force and generally one that's working in our interests. And to Bush's credit, I believe from that moment on, he stopped talking Western values. He talked democratic values. One of, I think, his great strengths was he was capable of putting himself in other leaders' shoes, in Gorbachev's shoes, in Kohl's shoes. It's kind of the way he thought. And I would say, thinking back on Bush, whom I greatly admired, still admire, and I think he did some impressive things, I would say, as I think about things he said publicly or didn't say publicly in one case that had a big impact. One was, I guess he said to aides after when the wall came down and people said, why aren't you celebrating? He said, I don't want to dance on the wall because that'll make it harder on Gorbachev. I think that was wise restraint, wise caution. But the other two examples that come to my mind are not cautious at all. And even though that President Bush is sometimes considered cautious, it was not cautious at all to embrace German unification the way he did. And it had a huge impact. And in those informal meetings that I mentioned with Ambassador Bartholomew, you could almost feel people wanting to say, I'm not so sure German unification is a good idea, but how could they say that when their boss, the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, had said, we're for it, and we want it to happen, and we more or less want it to happen quickly. And then the other one may not be remembered, but Bush declared almost within a week of the invasion of Kuwait, this aggression will not stand. I don't believe at the time he had any military analysis of how you could end it, any political economic analysis of what would get Saddam to change his mind. He certainly didn't have a big bureaucratic interagency study, I can assure you of that. It was just an instinct that said, this can't stand, and he went out and he said it. And once he said it, it shaped the way the whole world approached the issue. I'm not sure what he had in mind. He may have thought, as many of us actually thought at the time, that sanctions would work and Saddam would realize that he had to back out. But he had, as they say, put a stake in the ground and made it happen. Sorry for going so long.
That was great. Thank you very much. Give Ambassador Wolfowitz a chance to just drink a glass, a gulp of water here before Professor Loeffler goes after him. And in the meantime, I will remind you all, please turn off your cell phones because even if they're on, they send waves that disturb the harmony of the room. That is our electronic operation. So please turn those off. Please.
Well, I very much appreciated your comments, and they really helped to illuminate some of the larger contours of this period. I also like the fact that you started off with the framework of great men versus larger fundamental forces. And I invite you to comment a little bit more on how you understood those larger forces? To what extent did you understand those, quote, underlying forces? Can you provide some specificity about what you had in mind, and how did they shape, how did those basic perceptions sort of interact with some of your fundamental assumptions and shape the strategic planning that began in the spring and summer of 1990?
Let me try to think back here. Let me make two comments about process here, which Washington types love to talk about. Other people think, what does it really matter? So you can be on either side of this one. I remember when even before I was actually confirmed as Undersecretary, sitting down with a group of people and thinking about how should we organize the office. And one of the central points that came hard at me was the office I'd inherited was kind of the Defense Department counterpart of the State Department, and it kind of focused on managing bilateral relations. So there was an East Asia office that dealt with our allies in East Asia, and for that matter with the Chinese, with whom we had developed a defense relationship, or at least military-to-military relationship. Had a Latin America office, Middle East office, lots of arms sales and things going on. There was no Soviet office. Here we have the country that is the single most important country for U.S. defense policy, and in the Undersecretary of Policy's office, there is nobody whose job is to focus on the Soviet Union. In a sense, because everybody thinks they're focused on the Soviet Union, and in a second sense, because, well, the intelligence community has billions of dollars and thousands of people doing that, except the intelligence community is more or less prescribed from looking at the U.S. side of it. Once in a while they sin and they do a net assessment, but basically they're not supposed to evaluate whether U.S. defense programs are having the desired impact or a bad impact on the Soviet Union. They'll try to get it in through the back door. So I said, we really need some people who are looking at both sides of this. Eric Edelman is sitting back there. I don't know whether the genius was in creating the office or in finding a brilliant Foreign Service officer to run it. But it was also part of something larger, and Scooter Libby is back there. I brought Scooter in as my principal deputy undersecretary and put him in charge of not only this new Soviet unit, but a strategic planning unit, which hadn't existed before. Out of a sense that we really were heading into an era of incredible change. I had actually been offered a job at the State Department and was tempted to take it because I really thought the most exciting things in my lifetime might be about to happen in Eastern Europe. I can't say I had a much more precise view of that, but the second thing, which is in a way more important, and it's another one of these informal processes. When I worked for George Shultz, which was also a great privilege, he and Cheney have in common, I think, an unusual quality, which is on the one hand, they're very effective business leaders, decision makers. Their meetings are efficient, they lead to conclusions, they're decisive individuals, they're not afraid to make decisions. They don't waste time. Most people who fit that description get impatient with anything that begins to sound, forgive the word, academic. But Shultz taught me that you need sometimes in these hectic, busy moments to step aside and think in a freewheeling way. And I had never met the man when he was appointed Secretary of State. I was the head of the policy planning staff. He was confirmed as secretary at the same time that the Israelis were besieging Beirut. He was working, it seemed, 24/7 to negotiate a peaceful withdrawal of the PLO from Beirut and the siege. And yet he said to me, I want to be prepared when this siege ends to come out with a diplomatic initiative. I don't have time to think about it. I want you to pull together a bunch of people to brainstorm it. And we got Henry Kissinger, I remember, Bob Ames from the CIA, who was sadly killed later in Lebanon, Larry Silberman, Irving Shapiro from DuPont, who was an old friend of Shultz. And in spite of what he said, he actually joined us for 2 or 3 hours, brainstorming what do we do. And it eventually actually led to Reagan's Middle East Peace Initiative of 1982, which is one of many that unfortunately are on the dustbin of history, but it was a good try. But his real point, and he continued this as he was secretary, to say there are times in my day, usually on a Saturday, when I will take 2 or 3 hours not to make decisions, but to just think about something. I took this idea to Cheney, who immediately grasped it. He said, that's a great idea. He said, let's do one on the Soviet Union. So I went to Eric and to Andy Marshall, who ran the Office of Net Assessment, and we got a group of people in. And Cheney loved that one so much that I think we held, it's in the calendar somewhere, probably 3 or 4 more of these. He would say, get Eric and Andy to round up the usual suspects. That was the phrase. And they included, quite interestingly, 2 terrific CIA people, Fritz Ehrmarth and George Colt, who, by the way, I think were able to be much more frank in these discussions than in written, sanitized memos approved by all 11 components of the intelligence community. There is a virtue in getting down to the people who actually know what they're talking about. But also a lot of academics, Jeremy Azriel, Marshall Goldman, Ruth Gadamuller, Steve Sestanovich. Eric could give you a whole list. And Paul Goebel, I remember Paul Goebel because one of the things that came out in these was just how much the strength of these centrifugal forces in the Soviet republics and the strength of dissatisfaction within Russia. So I'm not sure I've answered. The point I guess I would say is I think over time and somewhat ahead of the curve, I believe, we understood that there was an enormous desire for change. And I think on one point where I believe this helped get the right conclusion is when the failed coup happened in the Soviet Union. And by the way, I think the early reaction was, by early, I mean the early morning reaction, if you look at Bush's press conference up in Kennebunkport, was more or less in the spirit of we may have to work with these guys, which I've heard in other contexts. Usually if you have to work with them, they'll have to work with you. Worry about that one later. Try to shape things the way they should go. And by the afternoon of that same day, Yeltsin had sent an urgent message to Bush saying, through our charge in Moscow, you've got to say something stronger. And we did come out by the end of the day condemning the coup. But still in the aftermath, there was hesitation about, well, how do we respond to the coming independence referendum in Ukraine? And Cheney's position was very clear, which is if the Ukrainians vote for independence, we should support it. And the White House State Department view at the time, as I remember it, was we should talk about earned recognition, which was to have certain conditions that the Ukrainians would have to meet before we'd recognize independence, one of which was to abandon their nuclear weapons, which would be, they eventually did, and I think, again, it was the Clinton administration that finally happened. It wasn't going to happen overnight, and our view, Cheney's view, let me say Cheney's view because he was the one who was arguing this, was that we shouldn't delay about it, and that delay is going to be harmful. In the end of the day, Bush did, on the eve of the vote, make it clear, I've forgotten whether it was publicly or in a leak, that we would recognize Ukraine immediately. And I think the record is clear. Gorbachev was very upset about this. He viewed it as a betrayal. I think Bob Gates in his book says this was a victory of domestic politics over principle. I would like to say it was a victory of one principle over another. And the principle was change is happening here. If we try to stand in the way of it, it's actually going to be bloodier than if we encourage it to happen. Now, I don't want to, I think the people who were pushing for stability, for go slow, were genuinely concerned, as anyone had to be, that this could lead to military action by the Soviet army and all hell could break loose. But Cheney was concerned equally that if it looked as though the U.S. was hesitating and possibly willing to see an intervention, that could be the worst thing of all, and therefore, use Paul Laxalt's famous words to Marcos, it was time to cut and cut cleanly and not be dithering about it. So I'm sure it helped that from a Secretary of Defense's perspective, the breakup of the Soviet Union was something not to be regretted in the slightest, obviously. But I think it was much more fundamental than that. I think it was the understanding he developed over the course of a couple of years that these changes were really powerful and that they were going to happen, and that U.S. could help support them. And I think what happened in Yugoslavia, by the way, is a case where we leaned in the wrong direction, and I think with harmful consequences.
Well, I very much want to have a chance to ask two more questions. So let me shift a little bit the framework here and ask you whether you think that better, however you might define that, strategic thinking and planning after the Persian Gulf War in 1991 might have prevented 9/11. In other words, was there an insufficient focus on non-state actors, terrorism, the growth of Islamic fundamentalism, etc.?
And I guess you're talking about the whole period of the 90s, or you're talking about...
Well, as you and Eric Edelman has written in a wonderful paper that we're going to discuss later, that there's a lot of continuity that emerges out of the planning you did in 1990-91 and the entire Clinton administration. I actually totally agree with that. So taking it together, conflating it, do you think that planning did not give sufficient attention to looming threats that were emerging and to areas of the world that merited much more focus than you gave it?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I guess first of all, I think we did give it a lot of focus. I think Bob Zoellick acknowledged last night that wasn't his area particularly. But I'll repeat what I said a few minutes ago. We had, and I'm not claiming too much prescience, we didn't predict this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, but we did say this is a potential source of enormous instability, that here you have, not only huge riches in the Gulf, but also the lifeline of the Western world in the hands of 6 very weak countries with a northern neighbor that has the 4th largest army in the world. It's dangerous, and we need to think about how to deal with it. We didn't expect to be dealing with it in August of 1990, but we at least anticipated that, and I think we're very much focused on it all the way through the end of the administration. I also think that the administration as a whole, and a lot of credit here to Baker, understood after the victory in the Gulf that this was an opportunity to try to push the peace process forward. And I think the Madrid conference, even though you can say it didn't accomplish too much, it was a breakthrough. This was the first time that most of these Arab governments would meet face to face with an Israeli official. It's hard to remember now, but up until then, all these negotiations were done with people in 2 different rooms and someone passing notes. The Egyptians were the only ones who had been willing to meet face to face up until then. And I think you could probably say that led directly to Oslo, which I certainly at the time thought was a huge breakthrough. I mean, some people, the whole history of the 90s is what was attempted, what might have worked, what didn't work. By the way, it bears emphasizing that I don't think there was a time in history when the U.S. was more active in promoting Arab-Israeli peace, nor was there a time in history when Islamic extremism and terrorism grew more rapidly. So I don't mean that there's no linkage, by the way. I do think the Arab-Israeli problem is a problem for us. I think it's something extremists feed on. But all I'm saying is the linkage between being active in the peace process and preventing terrorism is not as tight as some people would like to say. Not against the peace process. I think it's important to try to get it done. You can't be, by the way, an American ambassador in Indonesia and not appreciate the importance of getting it done. Let me just say that. So that was on the radar. I personally think that we overestimated the prospects of Saddam collapsing and underestimated the consequences of having this ongoing, not quite a war, but definitely not a ceasefire for 11 years, which required American planes based in Saudi Arabia throughout that period. It required American bombing Iraq on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis. It left a man in charge in Baghdad who was venomously resentful of the Arab governments who had helped to bring him down, who was so consumed with desire for revenge that he attempted to assassinate the former president of the United States, even after the new president had said he was willing to have new relations. And by the way, a man who on September 12th or 13th said the American people have gotten what they deserved, and until Americans suffer the way they've made other people suffer, its government will never change its policy. I think that we were too quick to end that war. We were too quick to accept that he'll just go of his own accord. And by the way, I think it also says something.
Did you think that at the time?
Oh, yeah. But by the way, more importantly, the Saudis thought so at the time. I remember on Jim Baker's first visit to the Gulf, right after the war, the rebellions had just started. There was some argument within the U.S. government that, geez, the people are Shia, the Hezbollah are Shia, the guys in Tehran are Shia. Maybe this isn't such a good thing. And Baker met with the Saudi foreign minister, Prince Saud al-Faisal, and the ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar. And the two of them spent at least a half an hour or more in a meeting. By the way, one of these meetings where you can speak English, so not half of it taken up by translation. And they said, Saddam is like a wounded snake. Leaving him there is the most dangerous thing that could be done. And then they said, and I was really struck by this, we're not afraid of the Shia of Iraq. For one thing, they're Arabs and not Persians. For another thing, they fought for 8 years for Saddam against Iran. They're not about to let themselves be ruled by the mullahs. But we decided differently.
And what motivated that decision to decide differently?
Let me just interrupt here because we're running out of time, and I do want to give some time to the audience. So we're going to open up for Q&A, and so Mike will be passing it around, but I'll let Mel finish this line here, please. Yeah.
What motivated the decisions of the government not to go ahead, not to go to Baghdad then?
But let's be clear about something, because this is constantly put out there. I don't think the Saudis were arguing for going to Baghdad. I know I wasn't arguing for going to Baghdad. At the time, I was arguing, at least let's stop him from flying armed helicopters that are massacring Kurds and Shia. And by the way, I think in a press conference, President Bush was asked about this and said something to the effect of Saddam agreed not to fly his helicopters and he has to stop. And I guess more or less as soon as he left the podium, it was explained to him, no, he didn't agree. General Schwarzkopf mistakenly agreed to let him fly helicopters on the grounds that the bridges were down. I think our response should have been, well, we let them fly helicopters under false pretenses and now they're going to stop, but instead we did nothing about it. I think so it's a false issue in my view to say we didn't want to go to Baghdad. I agree with that, but that wasn't. There were many other options in front of us. We didn't have to give back the territory that we were sitting on. I know Schwarzkopf personally told Baker, when Baker tried to say, let's create a demilitarized zone here at least to get better warning, Schwarzkopf said it has no military value, which is nonsense. But, you know, here was a triumphant general. I think he didn't want, I don't want to speculate on motives. I think the military as a whole said, we've won this war, let's not get into mission creep. I sympathize with their concerns about mission creep. Our mission was to get Iraq out of Kuwait. Actually, it was more than that. It was to end Saddam as a threat to the Gulf. But at any rate, our mission is done. Let's pack up and go home. Let's not make the mistake that MacArthur made going up to the Yalu and creating a disaster. Okay, it's reasonable arguments. I think they were wrong, but they were reasonable. And I think probably, but you'd have to ask State Department people, I think there was a concern in the State Department that these Shia were dangerous or that a breakup of Iraq would be dangerous. But what I do know, and I think it's important not just for the historical record, but for the contemporary record, it was not the Saudis that pushed us to do it. The Saudis tried to get us to keep pushing.
Great. So I'd like to open up the audience for questions. We've got about 10 minutes and would love to hear from people in the audience. So please, sir. We've got a microphone that'll be passing. Please use the microphone.
Back to the Cold War, you had an intriguing comment about budgets during the time when the Soviet Union was disintegrating. And I'd like to get a sense of to what degree did you think you could enjoy a significant peace dividend, or did it seem at that time at least that it was wise to maintain very strong defense budgets? And also, what do you think about the subsequent administration's handling of this and the idea of a peace dividend?
By the way, we thought there was a significant peace dividend. Again, one of the, for most people this is probably totally inside baseball, but I mean the New York Times took a leak of a draft of the defense planning guidance that I hadn't even seen and blew it up on the front pages and exaggerated to some extent what was in it. Some of what was in it I didn't like, but it said this is a blueprint for a major buildup of the U.S. military. Well, excuse me, it was a buildup. It was a blueprint for a build down of the U.S. military. I think some people would have argued it was too cautious a build down, but what we were basically recommending with General Powell, and Powell was very gutsy in taking on vested service interests here. I don't think Cheney and his civilian staff could have done this by ourselves. We were talking about taking 500,000. You know, in the Pentagon, all these big numbers float around. Cutting U.S. military from 2.1 million to 1.5 million. Now, that was still a lot more than we needed, and we came down further later, but it was a 25% cut in force structure. It would have been at least a 10 or 20% cut in the budget. And I think Cheney understood, I understood, certainly Powell understood this was an opening offer and that the Congress was going to take us down some more. But what the strategy attempted to say is, look, as you go down, let's keep in mind a few fundamentals. And I'd say the two most basic fundamentals were, number one, this idea of preserving our alliances. And by the way, when we briefed the Defense Policy Board the Defense Policy and Resources Board about this notion of preserving alliances even if there isn't a Soviet threat, the big opposition came from, I'm not going to name them, but we had some people in our group who particularly didn't like the Japanese and said, why on earth should we be wasting our money defending Japan? I mean, that was the real argument, and my counter-argument to that is, if you don't like what we're spending on East Asian defense now, just wait until Japan is a well-armed nuclear power and then see what we're spending on Asian security. It's much better to do it this way. And fortunately, Cheney came down on that side of the argument. So that was one flaw, in effect, was we need enough presence in Europe and Asia to keep these alliances together. But the other point was there are still threats. They're not as big as the Soviet Union. They're not global. They don't involve a lot of these fancy things that we uniquely for the Soviet Union. But they're threats, and there are at least two unstable parts of the world that we better plan for. One is Northeast Asia, Korea, and the other is the Persian Gulf. And I think one can quibble. Loosely speaking, my friends might say that the Clinton people went a little bit too far, but the fact is when we came into office in 2001, we were actually looking for whether there were more cuts available. Some people on my staff in 2001 were actually saying 10 division army is bigger than we need. Well, I'm very glad Rumsfeld decided not to cut the army below 10 divisions. It probably would have been better to have 12 at the time. But the whole idea of sending American troops to Afghanistan in the way we did was virtually inconceivable, even as late as 2000 and 2001. I mean, we were still thinking, I mean, Richard Clarke, for all he talks, was still thinking about some kind of a strike that would take out bin Laden, not how do we bring Pakistan on board to support sending American troops to the graveyard of empires. It's amazing what was done in a short time, but I guess come back to answer your question, I think we set a path for reductions. That path was premised on, let's see how the Soviets, or later how the Russians are doing. We had what we call exit ramps if things start to reverse. Cheney would say, give me a list of the 10 things that will tell us whether real change is happening in the Soviet Union. And Eric and his staff put these lists together, and Cheney had to cross off so many of the things because the Soviets were doing these things. He said, well, give me some more steps that would measure. But so the idea was we were on a downward path. I think it was the right path. I think somewhere along the way in the 1990s, and I'm not saying this not saying I saw it either. We probably should have seen that this global terrorism thing was going to put new requirements on the U.S. military, big ones.
Let me pursue that for a moment, because you emphasize that we, the United States, were on a downward path. But to some extent, that obfuscates the relative relationship of U.S. military capabilities to other adversaries at the time, whoever they may have been. I mean, the bottom line was that by the middle and late 1990s, the United States was spending more money on defense than all other nations in the world combined. Now, the reason in the defense strategy statements that started under your watch and continued in the Clinton administration, as you've emphasized, was to shape the environment, that was the framework, and to deal with uncertainty. My question, in part, is developing those capabilities to shape the environment and deal with uncertainty. You develop nonetheless, such huge capabilities that arguably it then tempts the United States to overreach with its use of military capabilities. So there's a statement in the defense policy guidance that says the following: our fundamental belief in democracy and human rights gives other nations confidence that our significant military power threatens no one's aspirations for peaceful democratic progress. That's quote, end quote. Do you really think that's true, that America's military strength and the way it has been used does not give pause to other nations in terms of our likelihood to overreach?
You've said a lot there. I mean, I'll just say I don't agree with the idea that this strength leads us to overreach. You can't spend even a few weeks in at least the Defense Department without encountering people who've personally experienced the incredible brutality of war, and that's what comes up immediately when you start to think about the use of force, even in something as relatively simple as Panama, which, by the way, was happening at the same time as all of this. Yes, of course it gives pause to people who are thinking about invading Kuwait. It's meant to. It gives pause to people who are thinking about invading Korea. It is meant to. I think if we go back to that quote, it doesn't give pause to people who are thinking about peaceful democratic change. And I guess I'd ask you to give me a single example in the world where people looking to promote democratic reform see the U.S. military as a threat. And I mean, the closest example I can think of, and it isn't really an example, I think, is the Philippines, where definitely for a period of time, Philippine Democrats thought that our attachment to our bases meant that we were propping up their dictator, and I think it was one of the important things that we did in the Reagan administration was to make it clear we preferred to see democratic reform in the Philippines than to keep our bases if necessary. And in fact, one of the very small but pretty brilliant things Powell did was, and it's in the history books partly because it was Powell and Vice President Quayle, who had no constitutional authority to be doing anything, who decided to put some airplanes up in the air to stop a coup attempt against Corazon Aquino, in support of democracy, in other words. There is a significant distinction between having the military capability to oppose dictators and aggressors and having the military capability that threatens democratic reform. And I think it's impressive to me in East Asia. how most countries in that part of the world are afraid of an American retreat. They say, we need you around. We, keep it quieter. Don't try to draw us into your conflicts with the Soviet Union. But you are a very reassuring presence. The last thing we want to see is Japan and China duking it out.
Well, there's much on the table, and there's obviously a lot more we'd like to discuss with Ambassador Wolfowitz. Unfortunately, this session is coming to a close. I believe the ambassador will be here for the rest of the day, taking part in discussions. So we look forward to talking more in our sessions that are coming up. Right now, let's take a quick 10-minute break, and we'll gather here again for our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you.